Before dawn on February 8, 1945, the jungle of northern Luzon felt heavy and airless, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. At 0600 hours, Sergeant Joe Mason crouched behind the cold steel shield of his M16 half-track, mud clinging to his boots and sweat already running down his spine. He was 24 years old, a Marine squad leader who had survived 2 years of Pacific fighting, and he was staring across a smoke-filled clearing 400 yards away as Japanese soldiers moved through drifting artillery haze. They had charged Marine lines again and again over the past 48 hours, 17 assaults in all, and every man in the battalion knew another was coming. Mason's weapon was not meant for this kind of fight. The M16 half-track, with its quad-mounted .50 caliber machine guns, had been designed to tear aircraft from the sky. Back at Camp Pendleton, Marines had joked that using it against infantry was like smashing flies with a sledgehammer. Even Mason had asked the armorer whether the thing was meant for planes or tanks. The answer had been vague. It was meant for whatever the brass decided. No one had explained how to use nearly 2,000 rounds per minute against men charging on foot. The 5th Marine Regiment had been grinding its way inland since the January landings at Lingayen Gulf, pushing through mountains that favored the defender at every turn. Dense jungle canopies blocked air observation. Steep ridges funneled movement. Cave systems honeycombed the hills, fortified for months by Japanese troops who had accepted that they were fighting a battle they could not win. Every night they came forward from those caves, bayonets fixed, screaming into the darkness. On February 5th, they overran Fox Company's perimeter. On the 6th, they broke through Easy Company. On the 7th, 3 more attacks killed 14 Marines, including 2 machine gunners cut down at point-blank range. That night, Mason was summoned to battalion headquarters. His commanding officer did not speak in abstractions. He spoke about dead men and collapsing lines. Malaria was killing Marines, but the Japanese were killing them faster. He asked Mason a simple question: could that anti-aircraft gun stop a human wave attack? Mason answered with numbers instead of promises. Each .50 caliber round left the barrel at nearly 2,800 feet per second, carrying energy designed to destroy aircraft engines and punch through armor at long range. The battalion commander gave him until dawn to prove what it could do. The early hours of February 9th settled over the mountains like a burial shroud. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Tracked vehicles clanked through mud. Mason leaned against the idling half-track, feeling its vibration through his back, staring into a tree lean 300 yards ahead where Japanese probes had tested the perimeter since midnight. He had been awake for 36 hours, his hands shaking not from fear but from exhaustion and the weight of responsibility. The M16 had arrived only 12 hours earlier, pushed forward by a supply convoy that had fought through ambushes to reach the line. Mason's crew had learned its controls from a Navy gunner's mate who admitted he had never fired it at ground targets. The technical manual was useless for what lay ahead. It spoke of bombers at altitude, lead angles, and steady flight paths. It said nothing about aiming 4 synchronized heavy machine guns at men running across open ground. Corporal Frank Thomas sat at the turret controls, running through firing sequences again and again. Each gun held a belt of 160 rounds, reloadable in seconds. The turret seat was cushioned, built for comfort during long engagements against aircraft. On the ground, surrounded by jungle-concealing snipers at close range, it felt dangerously exposed. Sandbags were stacked along the flanks. Extra ammunition belts were wrapped around the mounts. An anti-aircraft vehicle was being turned into a ground fortress. At 0545, Japanese artillery began its brief, violent preparation. Mason counted the shells by sound. 6 rounds, likely from a mountain gun hidden in the ridges. They burst in the trees behind the Marines, shrapnel rattling off armor, filling the air with splintered wood and cordite. This was doctrine: shock, then assault. At 0552, the first Japanese soldiers emerged at the edge of the clearing. Mason counted 40 at least, spaced carefully, more hidden in the brush. These were not fresh troops. Their uniforms were torn and stained, their movements disciplined. Lieutenant Haruto Yamamoto led them, sword raised, shouting orders as the familiar battle cry rolled forward through the trees. They advanced steadily, not in a reckless sprint but with confidence earned through hard fighting. Their target was obvious: the American machine gun positions that had bled them night after night. Mason's radio crackled with reports from observation posts, numbers growing with each transmission before mortar fire cut the lines. Thomas rotated the turret. Electric motors whined as the 4 barrels swung toward the clearing. The sights were built for fast aircraft, not men walking through mud, but there was no time to adjust theory to reality. When the Japanese reached the midpoint of the clearing, Mason gave the order. Thomas pressed both triggers. The sound was not a series of shots but a single continuous roar that tore through the air. Muzzle flashes strobed the darkness. Tracer lines stitched across the clearing. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. The careful spacing of the Japanese formation meant nothing against overlapping streams of fire. Men fell, vanished, spun backward. Yamamoto was struck and thrown into the jungle, his sword tumbling end over end before disappearing into the dark. Those who survived the first seconds tried to run. The turret traversed faster than men could flee. In less than 2 minutes it was over. The clearing fell silent except for settling smoke and the ringing in Mason's ears that would not fade for days. Over 7,000 rounds had been fired. A disciplined assault had been annihilated before it could reach Marine lines. By sunrise, the story was already spreading. Survivors stumbled back through the jungle, carrying tales that sounded like madness. Sergeant Major Akira Suzuki heard the first report from a wounded private whose terror was more shocking than his injury. By noon, similar accounts arrived from across the mountains. American guns that roared like thunder. Entire squads erased in seconds. At regimental headquarters, officers who had survived Guadalcanal and Saipan studied reports they could scarcely believe. They had adapted to American artillery and air power, learned to fight caves and flamethrowers. This was different. This was concentrated devastation, mobile and precise. Japanese doctrine had always relied on terrain, concealment, and the willingness of soldiers to die to delay the enemy. The Quad .50 shattered those assumptions. Courage meant nothing when a single vehicle could deliver the firepower of an entire company. Lieutenant Kenji Tanaka, who had observed the massacre from afar, described it without emotion. The weapon's range, its speed, its ability to sweep wide fronts. But it was his comment on morale that unsettled the room. Death had always been accepted. Obliteration was something else entirely. As more M16s arrived, Japanese commanders improvised. Frontal attacks were suicide. Only infiltration offered hope. Small teams might reach the vehicles at night with mines, though few would return. Reconnaissance photographs showed the Americans learning fast. The half-tracks were dug in, protected by infantry and cleared fields of fire. Vegetation was stripped away for hundreds of yards. Radio intercepts revealed Marine commanders integrating the weapons into mobile firebases, coordinating them with artillery and airstrikes. Fear spread faster than any order. Veterans whispered that resistance had become futile. Replacements asked forbidden questions about surrender. Discipline frayed. Nightmares swept through cave systems. Men woke screaming from dreams of thunder and fire. The sound of Quad .50s became a trigger for panic. Soldiers froze or fled when they heard it, abandoning positions without orders. Radio messages grew incoherent, filled with coded references to iron demons and thunder gods. American intelligence officers listening to those transmissions began to understand what had happened. The weapons were not just killing, they were breaking the enemy's mind. Surrenders followed. On February 14th, an entire Japanese platoon emerged under a white flag, explaining that resistance no longer served any purpose. More groups followed in the days ahead, men who had once fought to the death now choosing captivity over meaningless destruction. The final test came at Hill 212, a fortress of volcanic rock riddled with tunnels and manned by hundreds of defenders. Artillery barely scratched it. At dawn on February 18th, Mason's M16 climbed a blasted trail toward the cave mouths. Mortars fell harmlessly around the armor. When the Quad .50s opened fire, the mountain itself seemed to shudder. Armor-piercing rounds chewed into rock. Incendiaries ignited stores inside the tunnels. Smoke and toxic gases filled the underground chambers. Japanese positions that revealed themselves vanished under concentrated fire. A desperate counterattack reached within 50 yards before Marine infantry cut it down. For hours the half-tracks hammered every opening, collapsing entrances, sealing tunnels, forcing survivors into the open. At 10:30, a white flag appeared. Colonel T-Shirt Yamada emerged with what remained of his command. The fortress had fallen not to bravery or maneuver, but to mechanical dominance. By February 20th, organized resistance in the sector was over. Mason sat on the hull of his half-track, cleaning barrels worn smooth by tens of thousands of rounds. The victory was undeniable. The cost was harder to measure. Thomas's hands shook. His hearing was damaged. Others carried invisible wounds. Intelligence reports confirmed that Japanese units far beyond the battlefield were withdrawing rather than face the Quad .50s. The Luzon campaign had shown something new. Weapons designed for one purpose had transformed warfare itself. Victory had come not through sacrifice, but through overwhelming technological force that made sacrifice meaningless. For the men who had witnessed it, the jungle would never again feel silent.